Chapter 1. Born into Opportunity. He was born into wealth, but his journey would be anything but simple. Donald John Trump, a name that would one day be known around the world, began his life in Queens, New York. But this was no ordinary childhood. His father, Fred Trump, was already a giant in the world of real estate. A strict, relentless man who had built his empire from the ground up. Fred Trump wasn't just a father. He was a force of nature. From a young age, Donald could feel the weight of his father's expectations, and they were heavy. Fred Trump believed in discipline, in working hard, in pushing limits. To him, success was everything, and failure? Unacceptable. Growing up in such a family meant that Donald, the fourth of 5 children, was surrounded by ambition from every side. The Trump family was already known for its drive, its hunger for success. But for Donald, that wasn't enough. He didn't just want to succeed. He wanted to stand out, to be seen, to be remembered. From a young age, Donald had a personality that couldn't be ignored. He was loud, confident, sometimes even defiant. While his siblings followed Fred's rules without question, Donald often challenged them. He didn't want to simply walk in his father's footsteps. He wanted to carve his own path. But how would he do it? At 13 years old, his family sent him to New York Military Academy, a place known for its strict rules, its relentless discipline. Fred Trump hoped that the academy would tame Donald's wild spirit, shape him into a man who could follow orders, respect authority. But did it? Well, not exactly. Instead, Donald found new ways to stand out. He learned to lead, to compete, to win. Here, he wasn't just another student. He was a force. Whether it was sports, academics, or even simple popularity, Donald was determined to come out on top. And soon, he began to believe that there was nothing he couldn't achieve. Years passed, and Donald eventually left the academy behind. He went on to attend Fordham University, and later the prestigious Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. It was there, in the classrooms of Wharton, that he began to see himself as more than just Fred Trump's son. He studied real estate, marketing, and finance, imagining a future filled with towers, skyscrapers, and wealth beyond measure. But Donald didn't dream like other students. He didn't just want a successful career. He wanted an empire. And so, with his father's guidance and his money, Donald entered the world of real estate. At first, he joined his father's company, Elizabeth Trump and Son, which focused on middle-income housing in Brooklyn and Queens. For some, it would have been a dream to inherit such a business. But not for Donald. To him, it was too small, too safe, too simple. His eyes were set on something much bigger. He didn't want just Queens or Brooklyn. He wanted Manhattan. He wanted skyscrapers, penthouses, luxury, and glamour, and he was willing to risk everything to get it. But Manhattan wasn't just another market. It was the heart of New York City, the place where legends were made, and where many had fallen. While Fred Trump had always focused on stability and practicality, Donald was different. He wanted to dazzle, to impress, to make his mark in the biggest way possible. It was a bold ambition, and many thought he was foolish, perhaps even reckless. but Donald was never one to listen to critics. And so, in the late 1970s, he set his sights on one of his first major projects, the Commodore Hotel. The building was old, nearly abandoned, sitting in the heart of the city. But Donald saw potential. He made a deal with the city, securing tax breaks, working with investors, and soon the Commodore Hotel was transformed. It became the Grand Hyatt, a glittering symbol of success, wealth, and ambition. And with that success, Donald Trump wasn't just a businessman. He was a name that began to appear in newspapers, on television, and in conversations around New York. One project followed another. Trump Tower, a glistening skyscraper that would become the symbol of his empire, was next. Rising high above Fifth Avenue, Trump Tower was more than just a building. It was a statement. With its black glass exterior, its towering presence, it seemed to say, Trump is here, and he's here to stay. And that was precisely the message Donald wanted to send. As the 1980s went on, Donald Trump became known not just for his buildings, but for his persona. He was bold, brash, unafraid to speak his mind. He appeared in magazines, attended glamorous events, and became a fixture in the New York social scene. People couldn't get enough of him. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a celebrity, a man whose life seemed larger than life itself. But behind the glitter and the glamour, there were challenges and critics. Some saw him as a visionary, a man who brought new energy to the city. Others saw him as reckless, a gambler who took risks others wouldn't dare. But one thing was clear. Donald Trump didn't care what others thought. He was on a mission. And he wasn't about to let anyone or anything stand in his way. As the years passed, his ambitions grew. He began to invest in casinos, in airlines, even in football teams. The Trump name was everywhere, on buildings, on magazines, on television. He seemed unstoppable. But with each new venture, the stakes grew higher, and the risks became greater. Success, to Donald, was everything. But failure? It was lurking in the shadows, always waiting for a chance to strike. And yet, no matter what challenges he faced, no matter how many times others doubted him, Donald Trump pushed forward. He believed in his vision, his brand, his ability to turn any situation to his advantage. It was this drive, this relentless ambition, that would one day push him from the world of business into the world of politics. But that, as they say, is another story. For now, Donald Trump was still a businessman, a man who had turned opportunity into empire, dreams into reality. His journey was far from over, but already he was proving to the world and to himself that he was more than just his father's son. He was Donald Trump, and his story had only just begun. Chapter 2. A Drive to Be Something More. Donald Trump was not satisfied. Though he had built his empire, captured headlines, and created a name that echoed across New York City, he wanted more. Yes, he had power, wealth, and fame. But for Donald, there was always a bigger challenge, a larger stage. He wasn't content to just be successful. He wanted to be unforgettable. In the mid-1980s, Donald's ambition was reaching new heights. He had conquered New York, but now he had his eye on bigger dreams, projects that would make his name known not just in the city, but across the entire country. Real estate was still his focus, but his gaze was turning toward other realms. Atlantic City was calling, and Donald was ready to answer. Atlantic City, a town of flashing lights, ringing slot machines, a place where fortunes were made and lost in a single night. The casino business was risky, a world where competition was fierce and failures were common. But Donald saw only opportunity. He wasn't afraid of risk. He thrived on it. So, in 1984, he opened the doors to Trump Plaza, his first casino, a gleaming monument to luxury and wealth. He promised visitors the highest quality, the best experience, the ultimate thrill. Yet Donald didn't stop there. Soon after, he took a chance on a second casino, Trump Castle, another jewel in his growing empire. And then, the boldest move of all, the Taj Mahal, a project he called the eighth wonder of the world. Built with marble, gold, and grandeur, it was the most expensive casino in Atlantic City's history. But was it a masterpiece or a mistake? The Taj Mahal opened in 1990, and for a moment it seemed like the ultimate victory. Crowds gathered, the press swarmed, and Trump stood proudly before his creation. But behind the scenes, something darker was taking shape. The Taj Mahal had cost hundreds of millions of dollars, funded largely by debt. Interest rates were high, profits were uncertain, and Donald knew the risks were enormous. Could even he, with all his confidence, overcome the financial weight of this colossal endeavor? As the 1990s began, a storm was brewing. The real estate market took a turn, and debts began to mount. His casinos, his buildings, his empire, all were on the line. Donald faced a reality he'd never imagined: bankruptcy. His businesses were teetering on the edge, and his reputation was in jeopardy. Newspapers that once praised him now questioned his decisions. Could he save his empire, or would the Trump name be dragged down with the weight of his ambitions? But Donald wasn't ready to give up. He fought back, negotiating with banks, securing new deals, and restructuring his debts. For years, he balanced on the edge of collapse, working night and day to keep his empire alive. He made promises, struck bargains, and somehow, he survived. Many had doubted him, called him reckless, even foolish, but Donald saw himself as a survivor, a fighter. And with sheer determination, he managed to hold on to the core of his empire. Yet, even in the face of near ruin, Donald didn't shy away from the spotlight. He continued to court the press, to build his brand, to stand as the face of luxury and power. In fact, he leaned into it. He began writing books, sharing his business advice, speaking about the art of success and failure. He called his philosophy the art of the deal, a guide that revealed his bold, sometimes unorthodox approach to life and business. In this book, he was more than just a businessman. He was a teacher, a personality, a brand. He had turned his own setbacks into lessons, and the public was listening. By the end of the 1990s, Donald had survived one of the toughest times of his life. And in doing so, he transformed himself from just a businessman into a symbol of resilience, ambition, and some would say defiance. But was this enough for him? No, not even close. As the new millennium approached, Donald Trump was ready for a new chapter. He wanted to expand his brand beyond real estate, beyond casinos, even beyond New York. He saw himself as a personality, a public figure, someone who could capture the attention of the nation. And then came a new opportunity: television. In 2004, Trump launched a television show that would change everything. The Apprentice was more than a business competition. It was a stage. Here, Trump was in control, a powerful boss, deciding who would win, who would lose, who would be fired. His words became iconic. "You're fired" would echo through American culture, and soon millions of viewers were tuning in, captivated by this larger-than-life personality. For Donald, The Apprentice wasn't just a show. It was a new platform, a chance to build his influence far beyond the world of real estate. Through The Apprentice, Donald Trump became a household name in a way he'd never been before. He was no longer just a businessman, no longer just a real estate mogul. He was a star, a celebrity, an icon. People across the country knew his face, his voice, his style. And he knew he had something powerful in his hands. But what would he do with it? As the show's success continued, Donald began to see himself differently. He was no longer just creating deals, but shaping minds, influencing opinions, connecting with people on a personal level. And a new question began to stir in his mind. Could he lead something even bigger than a business? Something even larger than an empire? The idea seemed bold, maybe even impossible, but Donald had never been one to shy away from a challenge, and in his mind, he was beginning to see a future that was not just filled with wealth and fame, but with leadership, power, and a new kind of legacy. The business world had given him success, but perhaps now he was ready to step onto a different stage, one that would require more than just ambition, more than just strategy, one that would change the course of history. This thought grew stronger, more defined, and one day it would become a decision that would change not only Donald Trump's life, but the life of an entire nation. Chapter 3: The Apprentice of Real Estate. Donald Trump had built an empire in New York City, but he was no ordinary businessman. He was a brand, a symbol of ambition, a man who saw limits and chose to ignore them. From his father's influence to his rise in Manhattan's skyline, Donald had conquered the world of real estate. But he wanted something bigger, something that would set him apart. In the 1980s, Donald Trump's name was on everyone's lips. His buildings were bold, his style even bolder. From the gold-plated fixtures in his Trump Tower office to the marble floors that greeted his visitors, everything had to shine, had to be grand. His taste was lavish, extravagant, unmistakable. Trump wasn't just creating buildings, he was crafting a legacy, one that people would see and remember. But with success came challenges. And, of course, controversy. As his fame grew, so did the questions surrounding his decisions. Some praised him as a visionary, a man who knew how to make deals that others couldn't even imagine. Others saw him as reckless, taking risks that seemed impossible to survive. But Donald had one rule. He would never back down. He would take on any project, chase any dream, as long as it brought him closer to the top. And then, in 1988, came one of his boldest moves yet, the purchase of the Plaza Hotel. A historic building, a gem of New York City, the Plaza was more than just a hotel. It was a symbol of elegance, of old-world charm, of tradition. To Donald, it was also a trophy, a way to show the world that he was not just a builder, but a man who could bring new life to a city landmark. He paid an enormous price for it, taking on debt that would make most businessmen tremble. But to Donald, this was the cost of greatness. He wanted to own a piece of history, to leave his mark on New York's most treasured hotel. However, the Plaza was not like his other projects. It needed care, patience, a touch of refinement. But patience was not Donald's style. He wanted results quickly, and the Plaza's profits didn't come fast enough. The debt grew, and soon, Donald found himself once again facing financial trouble. His love for big, glamorous projects was costing him dearly. But still, he held on, refusing to let go, refusing to admit defeat. Meanwhile, Donald was expanding his brand beyond New York. He looked to Atlantic City, to Florida, to wherever his empire could reach. His vision was bigger than buildings. It was about creating a name that everyone, everywhere, would recognize. He began to attach his name to everything: hotels, casinos, even an airline. Each move was bolder than the last, each investment riskier than the one before. The stakes were rising, but Donald's ambition burned brighter. To him, there was no choice. He was destined for something more. As the 1990s arrived, his ambition began to catch up with him. The debt, the pressure, the weight of his empire, it was all piling up. His casinos in Atlantic City faced fierce competition, his airline struggled to find passengers, and his luxury projects were costing more than they brought in. Banks started to lose patience, investors started to worry, and suddenly, Donald Trump, once untouchable, was facing a mountain of problems. The press, once fascinated by his confidence, began to question his decisions. Was the man who seemed unstoppable now in over his head? But even as he faced the edge of financial collapse, Donald found ways to hold on. He negotiated, he made deals, he found investors willing to take a chance. In the face of overwhelming debt, he managed to save key parts of his empire. Through sheer force of will, he kept going, even when many thought he couldn't. His resilience, his unshakable belief in himself, saw him through. By the end of the 1990s, Donald Trump had emerged from a near financial ruin. He was bruised, but not broken. And while his empire was smaller, his name was still powerful. To the world, he was still Donald Trump, the man who had taken on Manhattan and won, the man who had survived financial disaster and emerged stronger. But for Donald, survival was not enough. He wanted to rise again, to prove that he was still a force to be reckoned with. Then, as if by fate, a new opportunity came his way. A chance to reach people not just through buildings, but through their TV screens. The Apprentice, a reality show that would show him as the ultimate boss, the powerful businessman who would decide the fate of hopeful contestants. The concept was simple, but the impact would be profound. For Donald, it was a new way to showcase his brand, to become more than just a name on a building. And so, in 2004, Donald Trump became a star in a way he had never been before. Week after week, millions of viewers watched as he stood at the head of a gleaming boardroom, his voice calm but powerful, his decisions final. "You're fired!" became a phrase that everyone, everywhere, recognized. His face, his voice, his style, they were now part of American culture. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a personality, a public figure, someone who could influence not just deals, but people. Through The Apprentice, Donald connected with viewers across the country, showing them not only his business side, but his charm, his confidence, his flair. People began to see him as more than a mogul. They saw him as a leader, someone who could make tough decisions, someone who was not afraid to take risks. And as his popularity grew, so did a new idea, one that had been slowly forming in the back of his mind. For years, Donald had flirted with the idea of politics. He had spoken about it in interviews, hinted at it in speeches, but now the thought was becoming stronger. Through his show, he had built a direct connection with the American people, a following that respected him, admired him. And he began to wonder, could he lead the country as he had led his businesses? Could he turn his brand, his name, his fame into something even greater? The path would not be easy. Politics was a world of its own, filled with rules, limits, opposition. But Donald Trump was not one to be intimidated by barriers. He had faced them all his life, and every time he had found a way to break through. To him, this was simply another challenge, another mountain to climb. In the quiet moments, he began to imagine it, to see himself not just as a businessman, not just as a celebrity, but as a leader of a nation. Was it just a dream, or was this his destiny? Only time would tell. But for now, Donald Trump was ready to take the next step, to face the greatest challenge of his life. The road from businessman to leader was not clear, and the risks were enormous. But Donald Trump had faced risks before, and he knew one thing. He would do whatever it took to win. Chapter 4. The Rise of Trump Tower. It was the early 1980s, and New York City was a world of possibility. The skyline stretched tall and proud, filled with buildings that represented the power, dreams, and ambition of those who dared to make their mark. And now, in the heart of Manhattan, a new structure was beginning to rise. Something bold, something daring, something that would change the city forever. This was Trump Tower, Donald Trump's masterpiece, his claim to fame, his legacy. When construction began, people could only imagine what it might become. But to Donald Trump, it was already clear. Trump Tower wouldn't just be another building. No, it would be a symbol, a shining testament to his ambition, his vision, his very name. He wanted something that no one could ignore, something that would make people stop, look up, and remember. And Trump Tower, with its shimmering black glass and towering presence, would do exactly that. It was 1983 when the building was finally completed, standing at 58 stories tall. This was more than just an architectural feat. It was a statement. It rose high above Fifth Avenue, where the city's elite strolled and the tourists gathered. It seemed to shout, "Look at me," and they did. Everyone did. For those who passed by, Trump Tower wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of success, wealth, power, and of course, Donald Trump himself. Inside, the lobby sparkled with pink marble, gold accents, and cascading waterfalls. Every detail was grand, designed to impress, to make people feel like they had entered a world of luxury. Trump wanted people to remember it, to talk about it, to dream of owning a piece of it. And it worked. Trump Tower became the place to be, the address that everyone wanted. To live or work in Trump Tower was to live or work in the heart of power. It wasn't just a building, it was a lifestyle. But this success was no accident. Donald had fought hard to make Trump Tower a reality. Securing the prime location on Fifth Avenue was just the beginning. He needed to gain the city's approval, navigate complex laws, and secure the finances to make his vision come alive. It was a difficult path, filled with obstacles, and many doubted he could pull it off. But Donald was determined. He charmed, negotiated, and refused to take no for an answer. To him, every obstacle was just another challenge to conquer. Finally, Trump Tower was complete, and the world noticed. Trump was no longer just a name. It was a brand. With Trump Tower, Donald had created something that people would remember, something that would stand tall, strong, and untouchable in the city's skyline. And Donald? He saw himself the same way, strong, powerful, unstoppable. But was he really as solid as his creation? As Trump Tower rose in fame, so did Donald Trump. He became a fixture in the media, a man who attracted attention wherever he went. Journalists wrote about him, magazines featured him, and soon he wasn't just a businessman, he was a celebrity. People were drawn to his bold personality, his confidence, his style. To some, he was the very picture of success. To others, he was something else entirely. Someone who took big risks, gambled with huge sums, and sometimes made mistakes. Because behind the gleaming glass of Trump Tower, there were challenges, risks, and debts. The cost of building the tower was enormous, and Donald had taken on significant loans to make it happen. Interest rates were high, and while Trump Tower was successful, it wasn't enough to erase all the financial risks he'd taken. He was walking a fine line between success and danger. But Donald didn't let anyone see his doubts, his worries. To the public, he was always confident, always in control. And perhaps he believed that if he acted that way, he could make it real. He had done it before. He would do it again. As the years went by, Trump Tower continued to be a powerful symbol. It hosted celebrities, politicians, business titans, all the people who wanted to be associated with success, with power. To Donald, it was a constant reminder of what he'd achieved. But he knew he couldn't stop there. Trump Tower was only the beginning. He wanted more towers, more buildings, more success. His ambitions were growing, and so was his confidence. But the bigger his ambitions, the higher the stakes. In the late 1980s, Donald expanded his empire with new buildings, new casinos, and a vision that stretched far beyond New York. He wanted an empire that spanned the country, maybe even the world. He invested in hotels, in resorts, in casinos, and each new venture added to his brand, his name, his fame. But with each new project came more loans, more debt, more risk. Some in the media began to wonder, was Trump overextending himself? Was he risking too much? But Donald didn't seem to care. He brushed off criticism, pushed forward with confidence. To him, these were not just risks, they were opportunities. And he believed that no matter what, he could always come out on top. But as the 1980s came to a close, the world of finance took a dark turn. The economy was changing, and Donald's empire faced the strain. Trump Tower stood strong, unshaken by the turmoil, but behind the scenes, cracks were forming. His casinos in Atlantic City, his other investments, were all feeling the pressure. And soon, Donald would face a crisis that would test his limits and his empire. But for now, Trump Tower stood proudly in the heart of New York City, a gleaming symbol of one man's ambition. It was a reminder to the world that Donald Trump was here, that he had made his mark, and that he wasn't going anywhere. His name was now a brand, his presence felt in every corner of the city. Trump Tower wasn't just a building, it was a statement, a promise, a challenge. Chapter 5. The Golden Touch, or Just an Illusion. In the late 1980s, Donald Trump was at the height of his fame. His name was everywhere, on hotels, casinos, airlines, and magazines. Trump wasn't just a businessman. He was a brand, a personality, a force. He moved through New York City like a king, confident, powerful, and unstoppable. He believed he had a gift, what some would call the golden touch. Whatever he touched seemed to turn to gold. But was it real, or was it just an illusion? As Donald's empire grew, so did his appetite for risk. One success wasn't enough. He wanted more, bigger, better. In Atlantic City, he built the Taj Mahal Casino, a palace of marble and gold that he proudly called the eighth wonder of the world. Inside, everything sparkled. Chandeliers, marble columns, and lavish carpets gave the feeling of luxury. For Donald, the Taj Mahal was more than a casino. It was a symbol of his power, his vision, his success. But there was one problem. This palace of wealth was built on mountains of debt. The Taj Mahal was an expensive dream. To finance it, Donald borrowed millions upon millions, signing deals with banks, promising big returns, believing it would all pay off. He was confident that the Taj would bring in enough money to cover the costs, and more. But things didn't go as planned. Competition in Atlantic City was fierce. Other casinos were fighting for the same customers, and as the months went by, the Taj Mahal wasn't making the profits Donald had hoped for. The debt was piling up, and there were whispers that perhaps, this time, Donald had taken on more than he could handle. But he didn't let anyone see his worries. To the world, he showed only confidence, determination, and strength. He attended grand events, gave interviews, posed for magazines. The world saw a man who was bold, daring, a winner. And Donald believed it too. He refused to accept failure. He was Donald Trump, and he would find a way to turn it around. Yet, behind the glamorous image, cracks were forming. Lawsuits began to pile up. Contractors claimed they hadn't been paid. Workers complained about unpaid wages. Controversy surrounded his casinos, with critics accusing him of unfair practices. The newspapers were filled with stories, some praising him, others questioning his methods. And while some were impressed by his confidence, others began to wonder, was Donald Trump truly untouchable, or was he headed for disaster? In addition to his casinos, Donald had ventured into the world of airlines. He bought Trump Shuttle, an airline that promised luxury travel for business passengers. The planes were decorated with gold fixtures, elegant seating, and the Trump name emblazoned proudly across each aircraft. But the airline was struggling to make money. Competition was fierce, and profits were slim. Donald was facing losses, and the debts from his airline, along with his other ventures, were growing larger every day. But Donald didn't back down. He pushed forward, signing new deals, borrowing more money, taking bigger risks. He believed that his golden touch would carry him through, that his name alone was enough to guarantee success. He was a man who refused to accept defeat, even when the odds were against him. As the years went by, Donald's problems continued to grow. The economy was changing, and his investments were starting to feel the strain. Interest rates rose, making his debt even more expensive to manage. Bankers grew concerned, wondering if Trump's empire could survive. Meetings were held, deals were made, and Donald negotiated fiercely to keep his empire afloat. He promised his lenders that things would turn around, that profits would rise, that his name would shine once again. But deep down, he must have known. The situation was slipping out of his control. In 1990, the pressure became too great. Faced with massive debts, declining revenues, and nervous investors, Donald Trump's empire was on the edge of collapse. The media, once filled with praise for his bold moves, began to question whether Trump was truly a genius or merely a gambler who had taken one risk too many. Headlines hinted at failure, at the possibility that Trump's golden touch was nothing more than an illusion. But even in the face of possible ruin, Donald wasn't ready to give up. He began to make deals with his creditors, convincing banks to give him more time, restructuring his loans, promising them that he would find a way to turn things around. He fought for every dollar, every day, every deal, determined to keep his empire alive. Many doubted him, but Donald refused to let go. He believed in himself, in his vision, and in his ability to survive. It was a time of intense struggle, of sleepless nights and high-stakes negotiations. To keep his empire from falling, Donald had to let go of parts of his business, sell assets, and make painful decisions. His lifestyle changed, his empire shrank, and for the first time, he faced the reality that he might not be able to save it all. But through sheer determination, he managed to hold on to the core of his empire. He had survived the storm, but just barely. By the mid-1990s, Donald Trump was no longer the unstoppable force he had once been. His empire had taken a hit, his reputation was bruised, and the golden touch he once believed in seemed to have faded. Yet, he had survived. While others might have given up, he had fought, negotiated, and found a way to keep going. To the world, he was still Donald Trump, a man who had faced near ruin and managed to come out on the other side. But the experience had changed him. It was a reminder that success could be fleeting, that the world of business was unforgiving, and that even the most powerful could fall. For Donald, it was a lesson, one he would carry with him as he looked to rebuild, to rise once more. For some, Donald Trump's struggles were proof that he was just like anyone else, a man who could fail, a businessman who could make mistakes. But for Donald, it was different. He saw himself as a survivor, someone who could face disaster and still emerge strong. The golden touch might have been an illusion, but Donald Trump's belief in himself was very real. And so, even as the world watched and waited, wondering if he would succeed or fall, Donald Trump made a promise to himself that he would return, that he would prove them wrong, that he would rise again. Because for Donald, this was not the end. It was only the beginning. Before diving into Chapter 6, let me remind you, you're with Woo English. If you're enjoying this journey through Donald Trump's life, make sure to share this series with friends. Like if it sparked your interest, and comment below with your thoughts. Your engagement helps us bring more captivating stories to life. Chapter 6. Trump on the Brink. The 1990s arrived with a cold, harsh reality. The glitter, the grandeur, the golden touch now felt distant. Donald Trump's empire, once soaring in the bright lights of success, was now shadowed by trouble, debt, and doubt. Bankruptcy loomed, and the very foundation of his business, his image, and his life was at risk. This was not the Donald Trump the world had known. Gone was the man who moved through Manhattan like a king, the one who could turn dreams into buildings, and buildings into empires. Now, he was on the edge, pushed to his limits by crushing debt, lawsuits, and fierce competition. The world was watching, some with pity, others with judgment. Could the man who once seemed invincible find a way out? Or was he truly on the brink? For Trump, it was a nightmare come to life. His pride and joy, the Taj Mahal casino, was a financial disaster, pulling down his resources with each passing day. His airline, his hotels, even his prized Trump Tower, all were threatened by the same shadow, debt. The bills kept coming, the interest kept rising, and the banks were growing impatient. Soon, it seemed, there would be no more deals to make, no more chances to save his empire. The once untouchable Donald Trump was cornered. But he was not ready to surrender. Even as the pressure mounted, Donald kept his calm, his confidence, his determination. To him, this was just another fight. A harder fight, yes, but a fight he intended to win. He called meeting after meeting with bankers, negotiators, investors. He went face to face with those who doubted him, speaking with energy, with passion, with the strength of a man who refused to be defeated. He told them he could turn things around, that he needed more time, that he was still Donald Trump. The negotiations were tense. The banks wanted their money back, and they weren't convinced that Trump could pay. His empire was bleeding, and the solutions weren't easy. But Donald didn't back down. He fought for every deal, every dollar, every ounce of belief. His strategy was simple. Keep talking, keep negotiating, keep surviving. For weeks, he worked day and night, bringing his business back from the edge, one conversation at a time. It was a gamble, a desperate, high-stakes gamble. But in the world of business, Donald had always been a gambler, and he had never let the odds scare him. He cut deals to restructure his loans, allowing him to hold on to his most valuable assets. He sold parts of his business, making painful choices, sacrificing dreams to save what mattered most. The Trump shuttle, his personal airline, was sold. His yacht, his favorite luxury items, even properties that once defined his image, were no longer his. Bit by bit, he chipped away at the mountain of debt, keeping just enough to hold on to his empire. But these weren't just financial sacrifices. They were personal ones. Each sale, each compromise, took a piece of the world he'd built. For a man like Donald Trump, these choices went beyond money. They were pieces of his pride, pieces of his vision. Yet, in the end, he was willing to make them, because one thing mattered above all: survival. He believed that if he could hold on, if he could just keep his name alive, he could rebuild, he could rise again. The newspapers, the television shows, the magazines, everywhere he looked, there were stories of his struggles, of his so-called fall. Some called him a fool. Others said he had reached too far, taken on too much. The world that once cheered him on was now quick to call him a failure. But Donald didn't care. He was determined to prove them wrong. To him, failure was not an option. It was a word he refused to accept. Slowly, his efforts began to work. The banks, seeing his determination, began to believe in him once more. His fierce negotiations convinced them to give him more time, to restructure his debt, to allow him a chance to recover. And with each small victory, Donald grew stronger. He began to pull his empire back from the edge, step by step, deal by deal. The man who had once stood at the top was now clawing his way back, proving that he was indeed a survivor. But the scars of this struggle would stay with him. The experience of standing on the edge, of feeling his empire crumble, changed Donald Trump. It taught him the limits of risk, the power of resilience, the importance of caution. He had faced a storm like no other, and he had emerged from it with a new understanding of the world and of himself. By the mid-1990s, Donald Trump had managed to save his core businesses, his most valuable properties, his name. He was no longer the unstoppable force he once was, but he was still standing. And for Trump, that was enough. He knew that as long as he could survive, he could rebuild, he could grow, he could become something even greater. The world had written him off, but Donald was still here, still fighting, still determined to prove them wrong. To him, this was a chapter in his story, not the end. And as he looked at what remained of his empire, he made a promise to himself. He would rise, he would return, and he would remind the world that he was not just a businessman, but a survivor, a fighter, a man who refused to give up. Only time would tell if his gamble would pay off, if he would truly return to the heights he once knew. But one thing was certain. Donald Trump was still here, still standing, still ready for the next challenge. Chapter 7. Reality or reality TV? As the new millennium dawned, Donald Trump was ready for a new chapter. He had survived a decade of financial struggles, near bankruptcy, and intense scrutiny. He was no longer just a businessman, but a symbol of resilience, a man who had weathered storms that would have destroyed others. But he wanted more, and this time, he would find it not in real estate, not in casinos, but in something entirely different. Television. In 2004, Donald was presented with an opportunity unlike anything he had done before. The idea was simple: a reality TV show that would pit ambitious young professionals against one another, competing for a chance to work with him, the man who had become a symbol of wealth and power. This show would be called The Apprentice, and Donald would be its star. At first, people didn't know what to make of it. Donald Trump, the real estate mogul, on a reality show? It seemed unusual, even strange. But Donald saw it differently. To him, The Apprentice wasn't just a show. It was a stage, a chance to reach millions, to show the world the power of his name, his image, his presence. He wouldn't just be a businessman anymore. He would be America's boss. The Apprentice was an instant hit. Week after week, millions of viewers tuned in to watch Donald guide, critique, and, most famously, fire contestants. His phrase, "You're fired," became iconic, a cultural catchphrase that everyone, everywhere, recognized. People were fascinated by his authority, his confidence, his blunt honesty. In the boardroom scenes, he was in control, seated behind a massive desk, his gaze steady, his voice calm but powerful. To the viewers, he was a symbol of strength, of leadership, of success. The show wasn't just entertainment, it was an experience. Contestants on The Apprentice weren't just competing for a job, they were vying for a place in Trump's world. Each challenge, each task brought them closer to what they believed was the ultimate goal: Donald's approval. And to the audience, it was thrilling to watch. They saw Donald Trump as the man with all the answers, a leader who could make the tough decisions. For many, he was no longer just a businessman. He was America's businessman. But was it real? Or was it just reality TV? To some, The Apprentice was an accurate reflection of Donald's real-life power, his ability to make deals, his strength as a leader. But others wondered if it was simply an illusion, a crafted image, a version of Trump that existed only on screen. In the boardroom of The Apprentice, Donald was always in control, always decisive, always the victor. But was this the real Donald Trump, or merely the man he wanted the world to see? For Donald, the line between reality and reality TV began to blur. The show boosted his fame to new heights, making him a household name in a way that real estate never could. People across the country knew his face, his voice, his style. To some, he was a hero, a self-made success story. To others, he was simply playing a role, an actor in the reality TV game. But Donald didn't care what people thought. To him, The Apprentice was a tool, a platform, a way to expand his influence, his reach, his legacy. As the seasons went on, The Apprentice continued to capture America's attention. Donald's persona grew larger, more powerful, more influential, and he began to realize something. He wasn't just entertaining people, he was connecting with them. Viewers admired his confidence, his directness, his refusal to sugarcoat the truth. They saw in him a man who was unafraid to speak his mind, to make tough decisions, to lead with strength. And Donald began to wonder, could this connection lead to something even bigger? For years, he had flirted with the idea of politics, mentioning it in interviews, hinting at it in conversations. But now, as he saw the effect he had on the American people, the idea began to grow stronger. What if he took his influence beyond television? What if he could use his fame, his brand, his image to shape something greater? Could he lead not just a boardroom, but a country? The thought excited him. Through The Apprentice, he had proven that he could command attention, that he could inspire loyalty, that he could be a leader in the eyes of millions. People listened to him, admired him, even trusted him, and Donald began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, he was meant for something more than business, more than television. Perhaps he was meant for politics. In the meantime, The Apprentice continued to soar, reaching new levels of success with each season. The Trump brand was stronger than ever, appearing on everything from buildings to ties, from hotels to water bottles. The name Trump was no longer just a name. It was a statement, a promise of luxury, power, and success. Donald's fame was bigger than ever, and he knew that with fame came opportunity. He had seen the power of television, the way it could shape minds, influence people, create connections. But deep down, Donald also knew that The Apprentice couldn't last forever. Reality TV was fickle, and he needed something that would last, something that would cement his place in history. And so, even as he continued to thrive on screen, his mind was beginning to look ahead, to something bigger, bolder, and far more ambitious. The show may have been reality TV, but Donald's ambition was real. His desire for something greater was real. His dream of power was very real. And as he looked out over the world, he knew one thing. The Apprentice was only the beginning. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and Donald Trump was ready to take on a new role. But what would that role be? Would he become a political leader, a symbol of change, a voice for the people? Or was he still simply a businessman, a man who thrived on fame, on influence, on control? Only time would tell. For now, Donald Trump was America's businessman, the star of The Apprentice, a reality TV icon. But he knew that his story was far from over. And as the cameras rolled, as the country watched, he was already planning his next move, a move that would shake the nation, and perhaps the world. Because for Donald Trump, this was not the end. Chapter 8. The Deal of a Lifetime. It was June 16, 2015, and Donald Trump stepped onto a golden escalator in Trump Tower. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward, and a crowd gathered in anticipation. As he descended into the lobby, the excitement grew, a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and perhaps a little bit of awe. When he reached the podium, he delivered the words that would shock the world. "I am officially running for President of the United States." In that moment, Donald Trump turned his life, his brand, his entire identity into a political campaign. For years, he had been a businessman, a reality TV star, a celebrity. But now, he was stepping onto a new stage, a stage that came with power, responsibility, and the eyes of a nation fixed upon him. Many people thought it was a joke. Some laughed, others dismissed him, and political experts around the country wrote him off as just another rich man with an impossible dream. But Donald didn't care. He had faced doubts all his life, and this was no different. He looked out at the world and saw not just a campaign, but an opportunity, a deal, the biggest deal of his life. And in Donald's mind, there was no room for failure. From the start, his campaign was unlike anything America had ever seen. He didn't use the usual political language, didn't follow the traditional rules. His speeches were direct, bold, and sometimes shocking. He didn't hold back. He talked about issues that struck a chord with many Americans: jobs, borders, security, trade. And he didn't care if his words stirred anger or admiration. What mattered to him was that people listened, that they paid attention, that his message was heard. Across the country, people reacted with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Some cheered him on, believing he was a voice for the forgotten, a man who would shake up the system. Others were horrified, offended, even fearful. His words stirred strong feelings, dividing families, friends, communities. He became a figure of controversy, of passion, of intense debate. Some saw him as a hero, others as a threat. And yet, despite the criticism, despite the mockery, Donald kept going. He attended rally after rally, each one drawing larger crowds, more enthusiasm, more attention. People chanted his name, waved signs, and hung on his every word. To many, he was no longer just a candidate. He was a movement, a symbol of change, of defiance, of taking control. He promised to make America great again, and his supporters believed him. But with each new promise, each new speech, the stakes rose higher. Running for president was not like running a business. There were no deals to be struck, no shortcuts to be taken. This was a world of politics, a world where every word was analyzed, every promise questioned. His opponents were fierce, seasoned politicians who had spent their entire careers preparing for this. They knew the rules, the tricks, the ways to win the public's trust. Donald was an outsider, a newcomer. He was taking on a system he barely knew. Yet, for all his inexperience, Donald had something powerful, an unwavering belief in himself. He believed that he could lead, that he could succeed where others had failed. He believed that his experience in business, in making tough decisions, in taking risks, would help him as a leader. And he wasn't afraid to say it. In debates, he was bold, often brash, willing to call out his opponents, to criticize, to challenge. He was not there to make friends. He was there to win. As the campaign progressed, the media couldn't look away. Every word he said, every move he made, became headline news. Some journalists praised him as a fearless leader, while others condemned him as reckless. Political experts debated his every move, his every promise, his every tweet. But one thing was certain: Donald Trump was unlike any candidate the country had ever seen. With each primary victory, his critics grew louder, more intense, but his supporters only became more passionate, more loyal. They saw in him a man who wasn't afraid to say what others wouldn't, to do what others couldn't. To them, he was the leader they had been waiting for, a man who promised to break the rules, to change the system, to bring America back to what it once was. But others questioned whether he was truly ready for the job. Being president wasn't about buildings or businesses. It was about people, policies, decisions that affected millions of lives. Could Donald Trump, the businessman, the reality TV star, handle the weight of the nation's highest office? Or was he risking everything? His reputation, his legacy, his empire, for one last gamble? As the election approached, the tension grew. Polls showed a deeply divided country, with opinions split sharply down the middle. To some, he represented hope, change, a new direction. To others, he was a symbol of fear, of uncertainty, of risk. His promises were powerful, but so were the doubts. Could he truly deliver on the vision he had painted? Or was it all just words, just another deal that might never be realized? On the campaign trail, Donald seemed unstoppable. His energy was fierce, his determination clear. But the challenges were immense. Every decision, every statement, every appearance mattered. He was not just trying to win a vote. He was trying to convince a nation. And with each passing day, the stakes only grew higher. In November 2016, after months of rallies, debates, and speeches, the moment arrived. The country held its breath as the votes were counted, as the numbers came in, as the future of the nation hung in the balance. And when the final result was announced, the world was stunned. Donald J. Trump had done it. He had won. The businessman, the reality TV star, the outsider, had become the 45th President of the United States. It was a victory that shocked some, delighted others, and marked a turning point in American history. For Donald Trump, this was not just a win. It was the ultimate achievement, the deal of a lifetime. He had defied the odds, silenced his critics, proven that his belief in himself had been justified. He had taken the greatest risk of his life, and he had won. But now, a new question awaited. Could he turn his vision into reality? Could he lead a nation as he had led his businesses? Only time would tell. Chapter 9. A campaign like no other. The race to the White House in 2016 was unlike anything America had ever seen. It wasn't just a campaign, it was a spectacle, a movement, a battle. For Donald Trump, it was his most ambitious venture yet. He wasn't just building towers, negotiating deals, or firing contestants. This time, he was vying for the highest office in the land, and from the very beginning, it was clear Trump's campaign would be different. Fierce, relentless, controversial. It would break every rule in the book. When Donald took the stage at his rallies, the crowds were electric. They chanted his name, waving signs, shouting, "Make America Great Again." His speeches were fiery, passionate, sometimes even shocking. He spoke about issues that struck a nerve with many Americans: immigration, jobs, security, the American dream. And he didn't hold back. His words were blunt, direct, often critical of the government, the media, the political establishment. He didn't speak like a politician. He spoke like Donald Trump. The political world was stunned. Candidates didn't talk like this. They used careful language, polite phrases, cautious promises. But not Donald. He was bold, he was brash, and he wasn't afraid to say things that others wouldn't dare. For his supporters, he was a breath of fresh air, a leader who wasn't afraid to tell it like it is. But for his critics, he was a nightmare, a threat to everything politics was supposed to be. They called him reckless, irresponsible, even dangerous. But Donald didn't care. He was playing by his own rules. As the campaign heated up, the rallies grew larger, the crowds more enthusiastic. People came from all over to hear him speak, to see him in person, to be a part of something they felt was historic. They cheered, they chanted, they waved flags. To them, Trump was more than a candidate. He was a movement, a symbol of change, of defiance, of taking back control. And as the excitement spread, his supporters grew more loyal, more passionate. They believed in his vision, his promises, his leadership. But not everyone felt that way. Many were horrified by his style, his words, his approach. The media covered every moment of his campaign, every speech, every tweet. Reporters analyzed his every word, debating his promises, questioning his tactics. And for each supporter, there seemed to be an equal number of critics, people who felt that Trump was tearing the country apart, creating division, stirring anger. To them, he wasn't a hero. He was a threat. His campaign was marked by controversy, by protest, by voices that shouted against him with as much passion as those who shouted for him. The debates were unforgettable. Donald faced off against seasoned politicians, people who had spent years preparing for this moment. But he didn't play by their rules. He challenged, he interrupted, he questioned. He didn't focus on policy details, on technical answers, on political talk. Instead, he attacked, he made bold statements, he controlled the stage. To some, it was unprofessional, even shocking. To others, it was exactly what they wanted. A candidate who wasn't afraid to stand up, to fight, to speak his mind. As the primaries progressed, Trump's wins surprised even the experts. State by state, he gained momentum, winning over voters, building a following that no one had anticipated. The political establishment was stunned. This businessman, this reality TV star, was winning. The people were choosing him over politicians with experience, with records, with years in public service. But Donald had one thing they didn't have: an unbreakable connection with his supporters. They didn't just like him, they trusted him. They believed he would fight for them, that he understood their struggles, their dreams, their frustrations. But with each victory came more controversy. The media criticized him, his opponents attacked him, and the political establishment tried to stop him. But every attack, every criticism, seemed only to make him stronger. His supporters saw the opposition as proof that he was challenging the system, that he was fighting for them, against a world that had ignored them for too long. The more the world tried to stop Donald Trump, the more his followers rallied around him. And Trump fed off that energy. At his rallies, he spoke with even more passion, more conviction, promising to drain the swamp, to fight the corruption, to bring power back to the people. He declared that he wasn't just running against other candidates, he was running against the entire establishment. To his supporters, he was a warrior, a champion, a leader who was willing to take on the world. And to Donald, this campaign wasn't just about winning an election. It was about proving that he could beat the system, that he could succeed where others had failed. But as the general election approached, the stakes grew even higher. The race was close, the tension immense. It wasn't just a battle for votes. It was a battle for the soul of the nation. To some, Donald Trump represented hope, change, a future they could believe in. To others, he was a danger, a man who threatened to undo the progress they believed in. The nation was divided, and emotions ran high on both sides. Each rally, each debate, each speech only added to the intensity. The country watched, holding its breath, as Trump campaigned with unrelenting energy, moving from state to state, delivering speeches that stirred both admiration and outrage. His words were like fuel, igniting passions, stirring debates, making people feel that this election was about more than just politics. It was about the future, about who America would be, about what direction the country would take. As election night approached, the nation felt the weight of what was to come. Donald Trump had run a campaign like no other, breaking the rules, defying expectations, rewriting the playbook of American politics. His rallies, his words, his energy had changed the country, bringing people together, tearing others apart, creating a moment that would go down in history. Supporters cheered, critics held their breath, and the world waited. Would his untraditional approach be enough? Would his promises, his passion, his connection with the people carry him to victory? Or had he taken one risk too many? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Donald Trump's campaign had left an indelible mark on the country, a campaign that had defied convention, that had challenged the status quo, that had shaken the political world to its core. And as the votes were cast, as the numbers came in, as the nation watched, Donald Trump's journey reached a moment of truth. Would he be remembered as a visionary, a leader, a champion of the people, or as a man who dared too greatly? Chapter 10. The Trump Presidency Begins. In January 2017, Donald J. Trump stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, placing his hand on the Bible, and took the oath of office. The businessman, the reality TV star, the outsider, was now the 45th President of the United States. It was a moment that stunned the world. A man with no prior experience in government, now at the helm of the most powerful country in the world. He had defied the odds, silenced the skeptics, and captured the hopes and fears of millions. And now, his presidency had begun. In his inaugural address, Trump's message was clear and bold. We are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people. He promised to drain the swamp, to end what he saw as corruption, bureaucracy, and politics as usual. To many, it was a rallying cry, a promise to bring real change. But to others, it was a warning, a sign that the presidency of Donald Trump would be anything but conventional. From the very start, Trump's approach was bold, energetic, and often controversial. He issued executive orders on his first day, moving quickly to deliver on his promises. He signed orders to tighten immigration, reduce regulations, and boost American jobs. Each decision sparked debates, cheers, protests. To his supporters, he was a man of action, someone who did what he said he would do. To his critics, he was moving too fast, too recklessly, without understanding the complexity of governing. But Trump was undeterred. He approached the presidency as he had approached business, with confidence, with drive, with a focus on results. He assembled a cabinet filled with people from the business world, choosing figures he believed would bring strength, skill, and, yes, loyalty. But critics questioned whether these appointees, many of whom had little experience in government, were truly prepared for the challenges of public service, and the challenges were enormous. The president faced a deeply divided country. Every speech, every tweet, every decision seemed to stir emotions, both positive and negative. Supporters saw him as a leader who spoke for them, who represented their frustrations, their dreams, their voice. But to others, he was a cause for concern, someone whose policies they believed threatened progress, unity, and stability. The country felt tense. In foreign policy, Trump's approach was as unconventional as his campaign. He met with world leaders with the same directness he had shown in business, often breaking from traditional diplomatic language. His approach to NATO, his dealings with allies, his stance on trade deals, all were marked by his belief that the United States had been taken advantage of for too long. He pushed for America first, demanding that other countries meet the U.S. halfway, that they pay their fair share. For some, it was a welcome change. For others, it was a dangerous departure from the alliances that had shaped global stability for decades. One of the most defining aspects of Trump's presidency was his relationship with the media. He openly criticized journalists, calling them fake news, and accusing them of being biased against him. Press conferences were intense, often confrontational, with Trump challenging reporters directly, rejecting questions he saw as unfair. To his supporters, this was refreshing, a president who refused to bow to the media. But to his opponents, it was alarming, a sign of hostility toward free press and transparency. The impact of Trump's presidency could be felt across the country. His policies on immigration were among the most controversial. From the travel ban to stricter border security, his decisions divided communities and sparked protests. But for many, these moves were necessary steps to protect the nation. His vision of America was one that stood strong, independent, unafraid to make hard choices. And for those who shared that vision, he was doing exactly what they had elected him to do. In Congress, Trump faced another challenge. Despite his promises to drain the swamp, he needed the support of lawmakers to pass his agenda. And in the world of Washington, deals were not made with the stroke of a pen. Negotiations were tough, often tense, and at times Trump found himself at odds even with members of his own party. Healthcare reform, tax cuts, infrastructure, each issue required compromise, patience, and diplomacy. But Trump was not one for patience. He wanted results, fast, and his impatience sometimes clashed with the slow wheels of government. One of his major victories came with the passing of a sweeping tax reform. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, signed in 2017, lowered corporate taxes and promised economic growth. For Trump, it was proof that his approach could work, that he could bring big wins to the American people. Supporters hailed it as a success, a fulfillment of his promise to boost the economy. Critics, however, argued that the cuts favored the wealthy, that the benefits would not reach the average American as Trump had promised. Throughout his first year, Trump's presidency continued to spark controversy, debate, and division. For his supporters, each victory, each decision, each act was a sign that he was fighting for them, fulfilling his promise to bring real change. But to others, the constant upheaval was unsettling, a sign that the country was drifting into uncharted territory. Would Trump's bold, unapologetic style bring the nation closer together? Or was it deepening the divides that already existed? As the months went by, Trump's presidency became a test of endurance, of will, of resilience. He faced investigations, protests, constant scrutiny. But for every challenge, he doubled down, refusing to back away, refusing to admit defeat. He spoke to the people directly through social media, bypassing the press, sharing his thoughts, his plans, his frustrations with millions of followers. And through it all, his message remained clear. He would keep fighting, keep pushing, keep working to deliver the America he had promised. In many ways, Donald Trump's first year in office was a mirror of his life, filled with bold moves, fierce battles, moments of triumph, and moments of tension. He was a businessman, but now he was something else, a leader navigating the complex, demanding world of politics. And for Trump, it was a challenge he embraced, a role he believed only he could play. Would he succeed? Would he be remembered as a president who changed the country, who kept his promises, who fought for the people? Or would his bold approach prove too divisive, too unyielding for a country that had always been a delicate balance of differences? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Donald Trump had changed the presidency forever, and his story was far from over. Chapter 11. Fighting the System. Donald Trump's presidency was like nothing America had ever seen. From the very start, it was clear this would be a fight against the establishment, the critics, the skeptics. He had promised to shake things up, to bring real change, to take on the swamp. But as soon as he stepped into the White House, he found himself surrounded by battles. Battles with Congress, battles with the press, battles even within his own party. It seemed that at every turn there was resistance. From his first day in office, Trump faced investigations. Questions swirled around his campaign, his finances, his connections. Committees were formed, hearings were held, and the press covered every development with intense scrutiny. The word collusion was on every front page, every news broadcast. The nation watched as Special Counsel Robert Mueller launched an investigation into whether there had been any interference in the election, whether there had been any links to foreign powers. To Trump, it felt like a personal attack, an effort to undermine his victory, his legitimacy as president, and he was furious. But he didn't sit quietly. Trump fired back, using Twitter to speak directly to the people, bypassing the media. He called the investigation a witch hunt, accused the press of bias, and insisted he had done nothing wrong. To his supporters, he was a warrior, someone willing to stand up against a system that they believed was desperate to bring him down. But to his critics, these were troubling signs, actions they saw as hostile toward democratic norms. The battle lines were drawn, and they only grew deeper, sharper with each passing month. And it wasn't just the investigations. Trump's policies, his executive orders, his very presence in the White House sparked protests across the country. Crowds gathered in cities, chanting, marching, holding signs that called for resistance. For some, his leadership represented a shift they could not accept, a direction they feared. But for his supporters, these protests only reinforced their belief that he was challenging the status quo, standing up to those who wanted to keep America as it was. Trump was determined to push forward, despite the obstacles, despite the criticism. He fought with Congress to pass bills, clashed with senators who opposed his ideas, and even faced resistance from members of his own party. The repeal of the Affordable Care Act, immigration reform, border security, each issue became a battleground, a place where Trump's vision collided with the established rules of Washington. In the boardroom, Trump had been able to make quick decisions, to move fast. But in the White House, the wheels of change turned slowly, frustratingly slowly. He wanted to change things, and he wanted to change them fast. But the system wasn't built for speed. In Washington, every move had to be debated, negotiated, refined. And Trump was not a man who liked to wait. His impatience often led him to push harder, to demand more, to challenge those who resisted. To his supporters, it was strength. To his critics, it was chaos. The media played a central role in this battle. Trump's relationship with the press was hostile, tense, even combative. He called out specific journalists, criticized news organizations, and used the term fake news to describe stories he felt were biased or inaccurate. Press conferences were intense, filled with questions, accusations, sharp exchanges. Trump spoke freely, sometimes breaking from the prepared script, sometimes launching into unfiltered thoughts. And the cameras rolled, capturing every word, every expression, every moment. To some Americans, he was a leader who was finally taking on the media, refusing to be controlled by them. But to others, his attacks on the press were troubling, a sign of disrespect for an institution that was meant to hold leaders accountable. For Trump, however, it was simple. He believed that much of the press was against him, and he would not back down. Then came the clashes within his own party. Republican leaders often found themselves at odds with Trump's decisions, his style, his approach. He wasn't like other Republicans. He wasn't like other politicians. And his unwillingness to follow traditional rules left many of them frustrated, uncertain, even wary. He dismissed advisors who disagreed with him, replaced them with people he believed would support his vision. Some saw this as strength, as loyalty to his beliefs. Others saw it as a refusal to listen, to consider other perspectives. But Trump continued to push forward. He wanted results, wanted action, wanted to fulfill the promises he had made on the campaign trail. And he was willing to fight for them, no matter the cost, no matter the critics. He was willing to go to battle with anyone. Immigration reform became one of the defining issues of his presidency. From travel bans to family separations at the border, his policies sparked outrage, support, anger, admiration. The country was split, deeply split, with some feeling that Trump was protecting the nation, while others saw him as dividing it. Protests filled the streets, debates filled Congress, and the media covered every moment, every consequence, every human story behind the policies. Trump stood firm, insisting that he was protecting America's borders, keeping the country safe. His critics argued that he was doing the opposite, damaging America's reputation, its values, its unity. Through it all, Trump remained determined. He was not interested in compromise. He wanted action, results, visible change, and he was willing to challenge anyone who stood in his way. But this unyielding approach came with a price. The battles grew fiercer, the divisions deeper, the debates more intense. The country was tense, restless, uncertain of its future. As the years passed, Trump's presidency became a symbol of both strength and division, of ambition and controversy. His supporters saw a man fighting for his beliefs, a man who was unafraid to stand up, to speak out, to make bold changes. But his critics saw chaos, a leader who refused to listen, who challenged the very foundations of government. To some, he was a hero. To others, he was a threat. The question lingered. How would history remember this presidency? Would Donald Trump be remembered as a man who challenged the system, who fought for change, who led with passion and strength? Or would he be remembered as a figure who divided a nation, who tested its resilience, who pushed its limits? Chapter 12. Legacy or Controversy? As Donald Trump left the White House in January 2021, America was left to reflect and to wonder. 4 years of a presidency unlike any other had come to an end, but the echoes of his leadership, his words, his decisions lingered. Some saw him as a champion of the American dream, a man who defied expectations, who took on the system with fierce determination. Others viewed him as a leader who had divided the country, leaving behind a whirlwind of controversy, emotion, and division. What would be his legacy? Would he be remembered as a visionary who challenged the status quo, or as a man who had stirred divisions too deep to heal? To his supporters, Donald Trump's legacy was one of strength, resilience, and triumph. Here was a man who had risen from the world of business, who had turned his name into a brand, who had faced both failure and success, and who had achieved the impossible, winning the presidency with no prior experience in government. He had promised to drain the swamp, to bring power back to the people, and to protect America's borders. And for them, he had delivered. They saw a leader who spoke for them, who listened to their fears and their frustrations, who gave voice to those who felt ignored by the political elite. To these supporters, Donald Trump's journey was inspiring. He represented the spirit of the American dream, bold, ambitious, daring to do what others wouldn't. He had shown that anyone, even an outsider, could rise to the highest office in the land. They admired his strength, his refusal to back down, his willingness to face criticism head-on. For them, he was a fighter, a man who put America first, who wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers, who stood as a symbol of defiance in a world of conformity. For these Americans, Donald Trump would always be a hero. But others saw a very different picture. To his critics, Donald Trump's presidency had left deep scars on the nation. They argued that he had divided America, pitting citizens against each other, stirring emotions that left families, friends, and communities fractured. His approach to leadership, they felt, was too confrontational, too unfiltered, too focused on himself rather than the country. They worried that his style of politics, so unyielding, so bold, so brash, had damaged the fabric of American democracy. For these critics, Trump's legacy was a warning, a reminder of the dangers of unrestrained power, of a leader who refused to compromise, who rejected the norms of diplomacy, respect, and unity. They remembered the tweets, the rallies, the intense, often controversial speeches. To them, his presidency was a time of turmoil, of constant tension, of a nation caught in battles that never seemed to end. They questioned whether he had truly fought for the people, or whether he had fought for his own vision, his own beliefs, his own name. One of the most powerful legacies of Trump's presidency was the way he changed American politics. For better or for worse, Donald Trump had challenged the traditional norms of leadership. He had rejected the cautious language of politicians, choosing instead to speak directly to the people, unfiltered and unapologetic. He had used social media like no president before him, bypassing the press, sharing his thoughts, his plans, his frustrations with millions. This approach resonated with some, but alarmed others. Could a president truly lead without compromise, without diplomacy, without the careful balance that had always defined American leadership? And as the dust settled, the nation was left to ponder the impact of his policies. Trump's immigration policies had sparked passionate debate. Some believed he had protected the nation, while others argued that he had alienated communities and hurt America's image abroad. His economic decisions, too, were viewed through different lenses. For some, the tax cuts and deregulation had brought jobs, opportunities, and growth. But others felt that these measures had favored the wealthy, leaving behind those who needed help the most. There was no single story, no single judgment. For every person who praised him, there was another who criticized him. For every voice that celebrated his achievements, there was a voice that questioned his actions. To some, he was a patriot. To others, he was a disruption. But perhaps the most lasting part of Trump's legacy was the division he left behind. He had not just changed the presidency, he had changed the country. Friends who once agreed now found themselves on opposite sides. Families who once shared the same values now found it difficult to discuss politics at all. For millions, Donald Trump had become a symbol of hope, of strength, of courage, or for others, of division, of chaos, of conflict. And so, as Donald Trump left the White House, America stood at a crossroads. His name would be remembered, debated, studied. His journey, from businessman to president, from outsider to leader, would be recounted for generations to come. He had left a mark that would not easily fade. In the end, would his story be a lesson or a warning? Time would decide, history would judge, and the nation would carry forward, forever changed by the man who had dared to challenge the system, to speak his mind, to lead with both passion and controversy. Because Donald Trump's story was not just his own. It had become part of America's story, woven into the complex fabric of a country that was still learning, still growing, still finding its way. And his legacy, whatever it would be, would remain a part of that journey forever.